It is a pleasure for us to have been able to bring Marc Metzger from the University of Edinburgh. As you see for his title, is what I consider quite revolutionary and undisciplined research at the landscape scale. And that's what we wanted to bring it. This is part of a research national project, dissemination activity. The project is called Future Green and is led by the Research National Spanish, the Spanish Research Council, CEIG, and from the UPM. As you see, it's very multidisciplinary because we are geographers working in the CEIG, and in the site of the UPM, we are urbanisms and agronomists. So that's something that I think is pretty necessary in research. Looking at the future, thinking of the future, and that's why we wanted to bring you here to inspire us and keep collaborating. And also thanks to the CEIGRAM for all the support with the dissemination, and thanks to the school and the department for being able to make this happen. So go ahead, Marc. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's a privilege to be here and to be able to talk to you for, I don't know, probably 45 minutes to an hour, and I think there's time for questions after that. But yeah, it's a talk. It's a version of a talk that I gave last summer, and Richard saw that talk and said, "Oh, you have to come to Madrid and talk to us here about this." And it's I was giving, I guess I tried to reflect a bit on what my career had been like in the last 10 years. So I guess I'm sort of 25 years into my academic career, another, I don't know, 10, 15 years to go before retirement. Not quite white, but the gray hairs are there. And it was quite nice for this talk this summer to think back of how I've changed track a bit, how I changed what I'm doing, and the challenges I faced and some of the successes that I've had. So it's not quite your ordinary presentation that just talks about a research project and sort of the rationale and then the methods and then the results and the conclusion, and that's it. This is a bit more of a reflective narrative with a number of examples of things that I've been working on, some things that have worked out really well, but also some things that were challenges that maybe did not work out the way I had hoped that they would go. And it turns out people really like the stories about failures, which is, or at least partial successes and not complete successes. So we'll see whether you agree or not. Right, so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself. It's kind of small from a distance maybe, but I guess I was always interested in nature, in biodiversity, and concerned about climate change when I was growing up. I studied biology at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And there I really liked the different components of the biological, but also the biophysical and the human social processes coming together. So I did a PhD within the agronomy department of Wageningen University. So it was quite a change from the biodiversity department, because everyone was interested in food rather than in protecting species. But it was a good eye opener into different perspectives. And I started using the concept of ecosystem services, which was really new at the time. I always had to explain what this meant. And it was in a European project, so I learned more about the diversities across Europe. I stayed on at Wageningen for a while with a lectureship in an environmental systems analysis, and did a lot of quantitative modeling and making maps for all of Europe. I enjoyed that, but I got the chance to move to Scotland, to Edinburgh. And work more in European projects, again, the modeling, the spatial modeling, the GIS, until about 10 years ago when we got a European project that was looking at how you could use this concept of ecosystem services to actually improve decision-making and make a change, a real-life change on the ground. And I really enjoyed that. I started doing more projects that were sort of in real life and no longer this mapping all of Europe and modeling things for all of Europe, but sort of more grounded. So then I had my academic career there. I'm now a professor of environment and society, which is a nice broad title. So I can sort of fit everything under that. It also means that no one quite knows what I do. which can be an advantage, and I'm trying to learn how to play that to my advantage, but can also be a disadvantage. Anyway, my whole career and the way I think about, well, the world really, is that we live in this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world with wicked problems, and we're facing a perfect storm. So we're in a world where we don't quite know what's going to happen. Everything's interrelated and complex. There are no single solutions. There is no magic solution to this. There's different perspectives, different solutions that work in different contexts. And we're facing climate change, we're facing socio-ecological change, geopolitical change, all of that. And we need to sort of deal with this complexity and ambiguity. But we need to find solutions, because obviously we, as a planet and as people, we are in trouble. And the problems that we're facing, the environmental problems that we're facing, they're really people problems. So yes, it is the environment, it is the climate system, it is ecology, but actually it's people who are causing these problems. It's people who will have to live with the consequences and who will have to find the solutions. So whilst my natural science background makes me understand part of the system, actually it is a social problem. We need to think about the human component. And within that, we really require solutions that have a holistic understanding. So we need to move beyond the boundaries of our degrees and our disciplines and find ways of working together. So for my research, I'm now really interested I've always been working sort of in the land sector, and I'm really interested in finding solutions to the climate and biodiversity crisis. My work is, and I started off with spatial modeling and GIS, but I do a lot of stakeholder engagement and participatory processes. I've done things in agricultural systems, in forestry systems, now doing some urban stuff as well. So as long as it's land and it's these holistic problems, I'm interested, and hopefully I can contribute. But I really like this, the landscape scale for working on problems, because it is a scale where everything comes together. People manage the landscapes. It's where sort of larger processes begin to emerge. It's also tangible enough that you can think about solutions. And I've really liked the framing of landscapes as a boundary object. That's a term from the social sciences, where you use a term as a reference point. And different groups everyone has an idea of what a landscape is. You don't need to have a very specific definition. You can talk about it without actually agreeing on the precise boundaries of where is the boundary of the landscape or what does it mean. It provides a starting point for a conversation. And of course, landscapes have sort of functioned like this for a very long time. So artists painting landscapes, there's so many different ways of painting landscapes, but you can recognize it as a landscape painting. And this is a painting by a fairly modern British painter, Peter Lanyon. He was a glider pilot in the Second World War, and he flew over the landscape, and that inspired him that when the war was over, that he wanted to become an artist. And he draws these modern paintings, but thinking about landscapes. So different interpretation from Monet or a Dutch landscape painter from the 17th century, but it's still thinking about a landscape. And in some of the work that I'm doing now, I use the landscape as a starting point for a conversation. So I'll talk a bit more later about trees in Scotland, but there's a big drive to plant more trees, or we need more tree cover. But where the trees go and what types of trees and what purpose they have, that is something of endless debate. And one way of trying to make that a little bit more explicit, but still at a conceptual level, is through these types of drawings where you can think about where the trees go, where is there space for more trees, but without having the very detailed specifics of a map and pointing out exactly where things are. Just talking about the trees in the landscape. Is it for production forestry? Is it for nature? Is it for green space in urban areas? That's proved really, really useful. The other thing, and this is becoming a bit more philosophical perhaps, but we have these really complex problems that we need to solve, and we need to have answers in the next, well, basically we should have had the answers already, but in the coming decades, we have these big problems. And traditionally, the approach to solve complex problems is through intellectual inquiry. Well, that's what we have science for. That's what we have scientific journals for. So since the 17th century, sort of academia has developed in a way that we have structures to think about problems. And that's sort of been formalized in different groups of thinking. So you have the arts and humanities with philosophy and history. You have the formal sciences, putting everything in functions with mathematics and computer science and logic. You have the factual science, which I was sort of brought up in, and probably most people in this room, physics, geography, sociology. And then you have the more applied sciences, which may be also part of this group, sort of medicine, engineering, forestry, agronomy, traditional ways of thinking about problems. And the same for landscape. It's emerged as a concept in science over time. This is a bit of a horrendogram, but it shows all kinds of emergence of disciplines from the 13th century up until, well, just about now. Landscape sort of started off in arts and humanities and painting and town planning and thinking about organizing landscapes, but then geography got interested, physical geography, human geography, landscape ecology. And you got all these subdisciplines and ways of thinking about landscape. And that's all great. That's the way science works. We are pushed to think in disciplines, to find people who think in the same way. And we start to build institutions around that. So disciplines are communities of scholars that use specific approaches and methodologies within their institutions. Departments in a university, journals you publish in, scientific societies you belong to, and you go to those conferences. And of course, at some point, what we realized that we should be collaborating outside our discipline, and we might work towards similar goals, but from different perspectives, and we have multidisciplinary projects. And maybe we try to do a little bit more, and we say we have to work in an interdisciplinary way. So we bridge a little bit between disciplines to work out a single solution, a single objective. But once this happens more and more, these interdisciplinary ideas, actually there's a strong push to push them into disciplinarity again. So you start to have a journal for landscape ecology, or you have a journal for hydrology, or you have a journal for geography, and you become a discipline. So it starts off as separate things. The way the academic process works, you get pushed back into your own department, your own journal, your own conference, your own way of thinking, how you should approach things and how you should not approach things. And so one step further is that you don't just collaborate with other academic disciplines, but you're interested in other perspectives and working with real life problems. So that's where transdisciplinarity comes in. You work with non-academic partners on a solution. But also there, if you do that quite a bit, then things like spatial planning or landscape architecture, they become academic disciplines again. And the problem with, or the issue with the problems that we're facing, the wicked problems that we're facing, is that in our rapidly changing world, these problems are not organized by academic disciplines. And the process of collaboration and forming disciplines is often hindering ways of thinking about solutions. So I was finding this in my own personal academic career. Oh no, there's one more slide of another. So beyond the disciplines, there's actually ways of thinking about knowledge generation. And so this is a term that they call epistemologies. And this is your epistemology. It's a branch of philosophy that examines the nature or the origin and the limits of knowledge. And there's different ways about thinking about this. Probably most of us here are sort of grown up in a tradition of positivism, where we believe that there is one true reality. We understand that reality through empirical observations. We measure things, we test things, we have hypotheses. We usually or mostly use quantitative methods, and that is how we understand what the truth is. That's our way of knowing. But there are different ways of knowing, and so there's a whole typology of different epistemologies. But if you work more in the arts and the humanities and some of the social sciences, they use an interpretivist epistemology, where they say actually reality is subjective and it's socially constructed. And you understand reality through interpretation, but there are different ways to interpret reality. And often they do this using qualitative methods. And your epistemology, it influences your research design, it influences your methods, it influences the way you understand your results. Now, what I've become to like quite a lot is a more pragmatic approach where you choose which epistemology you use depending on the problem or the issue that you're facing. So reality is what works in a particular case, and you need to understand things through both observation but also interpretation. And the person who interprets is really important. You have to understand where they come from and why they interpret things in certain ways. And I think there are lots of places where we want to use mixed methods of both quantitative and qualitative approaches together to understand what the truth is and what a solution is in a certain situation. And that also sort of fits with something that's very I don't know, trendy is not the word, but it's sort of emerged in the last few years as a really important thing to think about, is also indigenous and local knowledge. So different knowledge systems from different cultures and how you take that into account in your research. So certainly global research and research in the global South. The idea of sort of two-eyed seeing, this is a Canadian concept, but it's used a lot in sort of First Nations and indigenous communities, that you have your traditional indigenous way of looking at the truth, and then you have your academic way of looking at the truth. And actually these two can work together, and it's important to understand these different types of ways of understanding what reality is. So that also sort of fits within the pragmatism, I think, quite nicely, that depending on your situation, it's also important to respect and to understand what other ways of knowing, other eyes with the two-eyed seeing, how they see what the truth is. So I was struggling with quite a lot of these things in the back of my mind on what is my research and what am I doing and how am I doing things. And then I came across, or there was one of our PhD students was giving an internal seminar in our group, and they presented this idea of undisciplinary research. And I like that. I quite like the provocative term of being undisciplined, and something, it sounded sort of thought-provoking, but actually the definition of undisciplined research was that it's problem-based, integrative, interactive, and emergent science involving strong collaboration and partnership. And I was thinking, gee, that's actually what I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years. So it's work that is problem-based or solution-focused. You want to make a difference. You want to help address these problems. It's integrative. You use different perspectives, different approaches. It's interactive because you work with others and you sort of see what happens, which can lead to sort of emergent things that you hadn't expected when you set out your research project. Things happen in a different way and you need to adapt, you need to change things. And you do this research in partnership with others, and that can be other academics, but it can be NGOs, it can be companies, it can be communities. And so with this way of thinking about research, they say, well, actually, that's research that requires you to be methodologically grounded. You need to understand your research methods, so the limits of your methods, but you also need to be epistemologically agile. You need to understand that there are different epistemologies, and you need to use the right epistemology for the question that you're facing. I like this diagram because it also says that if you have low methodological groundedness and low epistemological agility, you basically don't know what you're doing. That's not research. You are in a conceptual la-la land. That's the wrong place to be. If you do that, if you see someone doing that type of stuff, or if you realize yourself that actually you don't quite know how you should do this and why you're doing it, then that's not science. That shouldn't be published. That shouldn't be funded. But if you have the traditional sort of high groundedness but limited epistemological agility, then you're just doing your traditional disciplinary science. That's fine and good. I understand that. But what I found myself to be in quite a lot with the things that I was doing in my journey was that I was trying for that top right corner, but actually often I felt that I wasn't as agile as I wanted to do. I didn't quite understand the different ways of thinking about knowledge generation. And also, there were so many methods to choose from, and I would try different things, but I was never as good as the people who came from a discipline. So I was able to do things that made a difference, but I always felt that I wasn't quite, was I doing real science? Was I using the methods in that proper right way? Was I fully understanding these epistemologies? And so a lot of the time I was in that uncomfortable place, trying to be in that top corner, but actually sort of often hovering towards that lower right corner. And so that was a relief to realize that I had something to strive for. I needed to move to that top corner. Also good that I could probably be a little bit more honest that it was an uncomfortable place. But still convinced that it fit within a framework and that I can justify what I'm doing. So I'll now talk through a couple of examples of the types of research projects that I've been doing and sort of reflect on what worked and what didn't work and why. And the first, most of them are, or just about all of them are focused on Scotland. I put in a little example from Spain, but so you have to sort of imagine Scotland. I guess you know where it is. Day like today, it's a summer's day in Scotland, right? So it's well, colder and wetter than Spain most of the time. I was in Malaga last week, and there was a red weather warning for torrential rain and all of the rest. And I was like, oh, you call this a red weather warning? For me, this is just Tuesday. Of course, it is what your infrastructure is ready for, because if we have a couple of days of snow, that would be a Tuesday in Sweden, and for us, it would be a red weather warning. And actually, 2 years ago, we had 3 days in a row where it was over 30 degrees Celsius. And that was just about a red weather warning. There were health alerts on the television. Schools weren't closed, but there was a lot of drama about 3 days of 30 degrees. So it's just what your system is used to and what you're adapted to. So this is a project that focused on a river near Edinburgh, where I live and work, that very quickly goes from a tiny stream to a very wide sort of, well, to the ocean, really. And this project focused on the first part of that river. And with climate change, there's more rain, and so there's more risk of flooding. So there are flood risks. And at the same time, the land next to the river is used for agriculture, not very productive agriculture. And so the nature conservation organizations, they saw an opportunity to frame explore the ability of allowing some of these agricultural fields to be turned into wetlands, which would then sort of buffer floods. So there's area to be flooded in a more managed way, but it was also really good for birds, for migratory species, for wetland birds. But what they didn't really know about how to do or how to tackle is that the local communities. So they knew that the farmers were not very happy with this idea, but they didn't know what the local communities would think about this idea. And so I had a PhD student at the time, Anya, and she had the opportunity to work with nature protection organizations to understand what they were interested in. And this project emerged that they were trying to understand whether or what the views were of the local communities about this idea of changing the landscape from agricultural fields up until the river to having this more wet environment. And so here you can sort of see on the map that it goes from here. It's really a tiny, tiny little stream, and it goes into this the Firth of Forth. This is a couple of kilometers across. So you can see that maybe in a stretch of 15 kilometers, it goes from just about nothing to the open sea. And they identified, the NGO identified some places that were very suitable for widening the river. And so what Anya wanted to do was talk to inhabitants, to citizens, about their perspectives, and then to inform the government agency and the ENGO about their ways of convincing the people that change should happen. So let's see. I think that does this. No. Can you press the slide, because there's a little film that will show. So Anya was this Finnish blonde 23, 24-year-old who went into this local community in Alawa, a deprived community, lots of people unemployed and sort of not very highly educated, but she convinced them to come to the village hall on a Saturday, on 4 Saturdays, to spend 4.5 hours with her to talk about the river and climate change and broadening the river. And she gave them some information, and they did various questionnaires, basically a choice experiment, where they had to see whether they would be willing to pay money to restore some of the nature. And in return, they would get the benefits of access to nature, and they would get the benefits of less risk of flooding. And the idea, sort of the underlying conceptual idea was, if you give them more information, are people more willing to pay more money? And I guess the second idea was, are they interested in this at all? So the really nice thing was that we got a really broad cross-section of society there. From, I think you saw a child there, sort of pensioners to young people in their 20s, all sitting together and talking about the river. And feedback we got afterwards was, gee, we never talked to these different social, economic, demographic groups together about this issue. And this has been really interesting. And it was, I don't know, a 75-year-old talking to a 23-year-old young man about something that is close to home that they never talk about. The young men, in the end, the only reason that they came, we heard afterwards was, or during the day, was we were paying them to be there. So we were giving them £40 in an envelope at the end of the day. And at the first coffee break, they were like, we are getting our money, right, at the end of the day, in cash, right? And we were like, yeah. So, oh, that's good, because we're going to go straight to the pub and we're going to get absolutely hammered, absolutely drunk with the money that we get. But whilst they were in the workshop, they were really engaged in talking and giving their perspectives. So it was a really valuable, interesting social learning process. At the same time, it provided insights that fed into a couple of academic papers with sort of the choice experiment results and sort of the community thinking about local nature governance. So it was we used workshops, the choice experiments, interviews. There was co-production with the nature conservation agencies. And it was sort of emergent. We didn't know what we were going to do exactly, but gradually that idea grew of those workshops, the location of Alawa, working with the local citizens. Unfortunately, fortunately, Anya got her papers and her PhD. That was really good. But then she had to look for another job. And there was interest from the conservation agencies to learn more about the research outcomes. But one of the local guys moved to a project on the other side of the country. So a lot of the insights that we had that we really wanted to feed into how they were working as nature conservation agencies, that was sort of our underlying problem-based, I'm making a real difference part of the story. That didn't quite materialize. People moved on. I didn't have time to further engage with the project, really. So there were some little bits, individuals who learned a lot from this, but it didn't lead to a step change on how the nature organization thinks about these things, which was, I don't know, sad and disappointing. So successful in some ways, less successful in other ways. For the same project, I had another student who did a master's dissertation, and that led to some further work here. And she said, well, it's all great to do these economic choice experiments, but I want to have a richer conversation with people. I want to really understand their motivations and their visions and their values for the area and for the land and for nature. So she said that she wanted to spend an hour talking to individuals, but rather than just having a quite confrontational sitting across from someone, interviewing them for an hour, she developed a method that she thought would be more engaging, where you'd take the person into a time machine, going to the future, to 2040, and she would start the conversation by just talking about their lives, because these are just people sort of off the street who don't think about nature all the time, who don't think about the future all the time. So she first wanted to sort of think about, what would your life be like in 2040, a couple of decades in the future? Where would you be living? Where would you be working? Who would be in your family? Basic things about your individual lives. And she had these were laminated A3 sizes of pieces of paper. And there were little cartoon images of things that characterize your life. And so there was a whole spread of these images on the table. And so you weren't looking for someone in the eye, but they were looking at the table, and it was sort of an exercise that they'd go through, and they'd choose the things that they thought were important for their life, and they'd just stick it on the A3 sheet of paper. And then gradually the conversation sort of evolved. So it was talking about also the landscape, and what do you do in the landscape, and what type of activities do you do in the landscape, but also what does the landscape do for you? So they started talking about things like, oh, well, actually, we know that trees store carbon, or we know that dunes protect us from flooding. But they chose the citizens chose those tiles from the table and had a rich conversation. We wanted to have some semi-quantitative information like Likert scales, like I very much agree or somewhat agree. But rather than having that sort of boring question, she came up with these dials with smiley faces, and you could just twist the knob to see what you thought about the answer for that question. And we talked about governance. So if you want that future that does all these things, how do you make that work? Who's responsible for these things? Is it the government? Is it local communities or individuals? Is it NGOs? Is it companies? And again, they could sort of write things down and choose tiles and draw, and it was all very, very creative. And and even some participatory GIS, but then in a very analog way. We had a map of the landscape, and people could choose images that represented types of things that the landscape did, and they could say where in the landscape that was happening. So in the end, in the analysis, we had a transcript, a recording of an hour's conversation with lots of qualitative information. We knew which tiles they'd chosen, so that was sort of a multiple choice, hidden multiple choice question. We had this sort of quasi participatory GIS exercise. We had the Likert scales, so we had a really rich data set to analyze and to see what people thought about the landscape, and we were able to cluster that in a couple of groups with quite different perspectives and quite different concerns and ambitions, which was really interesting. That information sort of fed back at the same time to the conservation NGOs, but the same problem that people were moving on. So we had this rich information, but didn't really know where to go with it. Luckily, through our academic network, we presented this at a conference, and someone said, oh, this is interesting. Do you want to join our research project and try this method in different parts of Europe? So we ended up, or someone else ended up doing some of this work in the Sierra de Guadarrama, just outside of Madrid. And you know that area a lot better than I do, I'm sure. I did go there for a trip for a couple of days, and sort of, so I know what the landscape looks like, but not the intricate details. But they translated the method. They added some new tiles because some things were sort of country or landscape specific. But it was also sort of testing whether this type of approach would work with Spanish people. I mean, obviously cultures are different, and maybe they would think this was too childish, or maybe, I don't know, other things that might not work. Maybe the images are just too Northwestern European. But it worked quite well. So they did sort of a participatory GIS type of question. We had a question of what do you definitely want to see in the park? What do you definitely not want to see in the park? And what do you actually not care about? And that's something that people don't often talk about. So there's often that sort of, we definitely want this, or we don't want that. But it's really interesting to also know what things are people sort of ambivalent about. And again, it was these rich conversations that led to insights that were shared with the park managers and some local NGOs that I know we hope informed some of their management. It was not my work. It was Maria Lopez Rodriguez, who I think works at Almeria University right now, who did the actual work. But we wrote a paper that has a number of these case studies together, including the methodology and how it works on in different cultures and contexts. On the Likert scale thing. So the last couple of examples that I'll talk about are more focused on trees and the landscape in Scotland. And so I alluded to this already. It's quite a contentious issue right now. Globally, I guess we're all aware that there's a big drive to plant more trees because trees store carbon, and trees can be good for communities, and for ecological reasons, it's good to have trees. But it's also can be quite controversial, sort of which trees and where and how. The World Resource Institute created this map in some way where they identified areas of the world where there were opportunities for reforestation or more trees. And there's quite a lot of green color in the tropics and so on, but actually, and it's too small to see, but Scotland is colored in green. It's an area that has wide-scale opportunities for forest and landscape restoration, which is great and interesting. But it means that a lot of the problems that other parts of the world are facing, we're actually facing them, social problems and sort of contestation, we're facing those in Scotland. Now, many people know Scotland for landscapes like this. This is what we put on our tourist brochures. This is what we put on our postcards. A beautiful wild landscape, not very many trees, not very many people. very nice for driving through. There might be a distillery hidden behind that hill, so that's a nice destination to have some whiskey. Who knows, maybe someone's playing a bagpipe on another hill. It's very good for tourists, but ecologically, it's a wet desert. There's not very much growing there. There's a couple of species of grass or small shrubs growing there, but for biodiversity, there isn't so much. And because, of course, we're in Scotland, it's not a normal desert. It's a wet desert. There are lots of plans to get more out of the land. So we have a land use strategy that says getting the best from our land. This is the third one. There's sort of a government vision on trying to make the land provide more benefits to society. And that can be economic benefits or it can be cultural benefits. And one of the things that the government wants to do is to plant 100,000 hectares of new woodlands. 18 to 25% of Scotland should be covered by woodland in 2050. So anyway, that's quite a substantial target. And the question is, what type of trees and where do they go? And within that, they acknowledge that we should learn from the past. So at the start of the 20th century, sort of 1910 or something, there was basically no trees left in Scotland. It was completely bare. First World War realized that we actually didn't have enough, that the UK didn't have enough timber supply. So the realization that more trees should be planted. And there was a very strong sort of, industrial forestry drive where they would plow up these often sort of organic soils to plant the same trees in long rows of, and I guess you have maybe some eucalyptus plantations in Spain. Here it is Sitka spruce in Scotland. And these soils they're peat soils. So they drained the peat and they plowed it, so all the carbon was released, and then they plant the trees in it. And what you end up with is the landscape sort of looking like this, where you have square patches of Sitka trees, pine trees that are all the same age, and at some point they will all be cut, and then they might be replanted. And so this doesn't look great if you're an ecologist. For biodiversity, it's not good. For timber supply, it's quite good. And yes, we do need timber, and we want to go to a bioeconomy with less concrete and steel and so on. So for timber, it's fine. But you should be able to do this in a nicer way than just these square blocks. And this is just a graph of the sort of the woodland expansion from you see on the left-hand side is sort of 1900 or 1910 at 1%. And we're sort of at 12 now, maybe about 18 right now, I think, and they want to go to 25. So it's a quite drastic increase of trees. So where should these go? And what type of trees do we want? And it's really important within that to understand and appreciate that different types of woodland or different types of trees have different benefits. And these benefits are different for different groups of people. So again, it becomes from a sort of a silvicultural problem on where can we go to grow trees and how much timber will it provide, actually to a socio-ecological problem on why do we plant these trees and for whom do we plant them. So the graph on the left shows that if you have basically if you're focused on fiber or timber production, if you just want to have timber, then you plant these Sitka spruce trees. They're good for that, right? They're great. And you will, the more you manage them, the faster they'll grow, the better they'll grow, you get more timber. But if you do that, there's other benefits or ecosystem services that actually decline. So biodiversity declines, the value for recreation and for health, some sort of water purification types of things, that all becomes less if you just focus on these productive species. But if you're a forester or if you're a landowner who can earn a lot of money from your timber, then that's a good way to use the land. Why not? If you're a conservation person or if you have a tourist industry business or something like that, or maybe if you want to rewild and have lots of biodiversity because that's good for the members of your NGO, then you want to have different types of forests. So sort of with that in mind, we had a small project in the southwest of Scotland, in Galloway and Ayrshire, and that's an area that it has hills, but it also has very reasonably good agricultural land. And there are not so many people live there, so it's a very good corner to do stuff without getting too many complaints, except for some local, villagers and farming communities. So it's an area that produces all the milk in Scotland for dairy, very intensive. It's an area that produces, I don't know, 60 or 70% of the timber. It's an area that produces maybe 30 or 40% of the wind energy. But we wanted to see whether actually there was still scope to plant some more trees in that area, because it's also very good soils and relatively good soils and good climate for growing trees. So we sort of went in there, wanting to ask the communities, we know that there's lots of trees in your area, and we know that, I don't know, here's an example, that when you want to go somewhere, you're stuck in traffic behind the timber lorries. We know that they drive through your village at 3 a.m. But don't you think that maybe there is the scope to plant a few more trees in this landscape? So it's a kind of a difficult ask, but we also realize that there are still places where maybe there is potential, and we wanted to see, so where could we squeeze something more? Is there the potential to squeeze something more in? So we had some, and the idea was actually that we could at the end develop a spatial tool that they could use to identify where these new forests could go. So we had a very nice workshop with a very diverse group of people from the area to talk about this, but we, just like with the interviews before, sort of the visual interviews, we took a step backwards and sort of asked them more about what they wanted from the land in the future and from the area in the future. And then we wanted to work our way back, that how does potentially more trees or what types of trees fit into that landscape? And that was a really, really positive, great day. In the end, it turned out that people felt a responsibility. This is an area of Scotland where we can do more. We know about climate change. We know about biodiversity crisis. We have a beautiful landscape here that we should take our responsibility and see what we can do. But it's not just about sort of planting trees or more trees in the landscape is fine, but it's conditional on all kinds of other things. We want to have jobs for living here. We want to have better transport system. We need to have schools for our children to go to. We need to have, I don't know, medical facilities that will keep people in the area. So if there's a thriving economy doing lots of different things, within that thriving economy, there's space for having an economy that's based on more of a timber sector. But then maybe the trees shouldn't be carried out of the region, but we should have sawmills in the region that provide jobs. So it became from a sort of technocratic, can we develop a GIS tool that tells us where we can put more trees, into something that was like, well, actually, we have to think about the whole rural development of this area and how trees fit within that. But they basically said, well, if we get this right, the area, there's loads of scope. So this was sort of the area now with lots of sort of, I don't know, big square blocks, lots of intensive agriculture. With their new vision, it was, we want a living and thriving and working landscape. And within that landscape, we can have more trees. We can connect existing woodlands. We can plant some more biodiversity-rich trees around the existing woodlands. But we want to have a timber factory or a timber processing factory. And let's see. So yeah, things that they said was, okay, existing woodlands can be bigger and can be connected. That's fine. We can restore peatlands as well for more carbon storage and biodiversity. There's scope along rivers to plant more trees. That's good for shadow for the rivers to keep them cool. It looks nice. It's a good corridor in the landscape for biodiversity. We can have silvopastoral systems and maybe fruit trees with the cows under them. In Scotland, there's no agroforestry, no silvopastoral systems. So they were thinking, well, based on sort of knowing about Spain and Portugal, maybe there's scope to have more of that. We can have street trees in our villages because there aren't any right now. And we can do things like have outdoor nurseries or outdoor weddings where we can bring tourists in to have their wedding in our forests. So they had all kinds of creative ideas for more trees in the landscape. But all of that functions within an economy that is sustainable and with having jobs and so on. So that was a bit of an eye-opener to have real conversations with people about the challenges they face and where they think solutions could be. Then after that first workshop, COVID hit. So we were planning a second workshop and we were planning a deliberative process to develop our tool to make it work for their context. COVID hit, we had to start doing things online. People had other things to worry about than trees in the landscape and so on. Our online workshops were not very well attended. And also what we tried to show them that based on their vision, we developed rules that we could put into the GIS to identify locations that maybe could have some more trees. They found all the errors in, well, this data set is wrong and this doesn't work here and that guy will never collaborate. And, oh no, I don't want it here because this is where I walk my dog, and all those types of problems emerged. So the idea of developing that tool, technocratic, sort of by experts in different European countries for their region, they were like, no, we like doing the visioning workshop. Yes, there is scope, we can have a longer conversation. But no, it doesn't work that in the next 6 months you develop a tool and that tool is going to be used and now we're going to have trees. No, Professor Metzger, go away. So it was a really interesting project to learn about collaboration and co-production, to understand the real issues in the community, to start to see where solutions could be. But then we tried to be way too fast, and COVID didn't help, but we tried to be way too fast to say, okay, we've listened to you, this was great, and now we have the solution, this is it. We just do a couple of webinars and then it's sorted. So, I don't know, I learned from that about the slowly approach, and that things take time, and that you can have a partial success, but not a full success. But probably more lessons for me and sort of colleagues that we learned than that the local communities had benefits from the work that we did. Will I skip through this? No, I won't. This is another woodland example, but this was in the northwest of Scotland, working on one area that was managed by the National Forest Agency. And every 10 years, they need to develop new plans on what they're going to plant and how they're going to manage the forest. And I had a PhD student who worked in forest research, which is the research branch of the Forestry Commission. And she was going to work with the forest manager to see how models that would project the impacts of climate change on different ecosystem services, how those models could be used in thinking about the future plan. So Louise went and chatted to the forest manager extensively to understand the forest and the issues. And she was a GIS spatial modeler, and she thought she was just going to run the models that she already knew, but for this very particular forest. But the first thing that emerged sort of after a few conversations was that the biggest sort of challenge for the forest manager was to understand what the visitors to the forests and the local communities, what they actually wanted to see in the forest, how they would like to have, what type of forest they wanted to use for recreation, for mountain biking, for tourism. So Louise, who is this GIS person, was asked these questions about sort of really social issues in the community. But in the end, she went out there and did a survey with an iPad asking questions. But rather than just asking boring questions about what do you think of this forest or should we have more trees, she had an interactive display where the interviewee could choose what they wanted to have into a fictional landscape. So you see these two images at the top. It's the same background landscape, but they could choose how many trees they wanted in there, or how many paths they wanted in there, or how much biodiversity they wanted to see, or whether there should be wind turbines. And sort of obviously you couldn't fit everything into the landscape. So if they wanted to put more of something in, at some point the landscape was full. So they basically had to make sort of a trade-off analysis themselves in a very stylistic cartoon style to get to the landscape that they thought would be nice for the area. What mixture of productive forest and a diverse native forest. We were able to use that as type of a multiple choice survey to do a cluster analysis to see what types of archetypical landscapes people liked. So from a couple of hundred individual scores, we got 4 or 5 different archetype landscapes and showed that people were not against the idea of having productive forests, but they also like to have some diversity in the landscape and maybe some more native forests, that biodiversity was important to them. So that was something that the forest manager wanted to take on board. Then Louise created loads of maps of different alternatives for different climate scenarios for that forest for maybe 7 or 8 different ecosystem services. And the forest manager was like, geez, what do I do with that? This is too much information. So she had to develop a visual interface And I think if you click on the slide, there'll be a small little video that shows some things moving, but you had to program this visual interface that shows where the forest manager could choose different climate scenarios, different ecosystem services, different configurations, and sort of play with that to then understand how she could develop her plan. So in the end, the forest manager was really like the process. It took 7 years of collaboration. I think there was something like 50 hours of meeting together to go through this. But in the end, there were crucial tweaks that were made in how the forest is managed based on this interaction. So yes, we had a positive outcome. The research was being used. Everyone was happy. Louise got her PhD. And then we needed to try to write this up as an academic paper. And there the challenge was the models that we used were not novel, not new, not special. It was a very small case study in a part of Scotland. I mean, how interesting and relevant is that for the international academic literature? So I know we played for a while, finally got a manuscript ready, submitted it. Took forever to get reviewers to agree to review this. Review process took, I don't know, more than a year. One of the reviewers just wanted to have more quantitative results about the models and full descriptions about the models. And we were like, but that's not the point. There is supplementary material that explains all of this. And there is 10 existing papers, but this is about the collaboration with the forest manager, major revision and so on. It's now, I got the last review back on Christmas Day. With very minor revisions, but it's still on the editor's desk. But hopefully it will get published. I'll say a few words about Edinburgh, but not too much. That ecosystem service modeling type of exercise is something that cities now like in Scotland. So one of my students was asked to do the work for Edinburgh. Edinburgh used that to understand where in the city they could improve green space to have the biggest benefit for the public. So not just for biodiversity, but also for flood regulation and for recreation. Then they talked to citizens and NGOs to find out where improvements could be made to green space, and that's been used to justify further investment because there's not very much public money around anymore, but this was a way of filtering down priorities. Edinburgh developed a number of strategies for the city around this, but also the Scottish government picked this up and said, oh, this is an interesting process. All local authorities around Scotland now need to follow a similar process to prioritize what they're going to do with green space. So if you want to talk about a story where you have impact with your research, and it really is making a difference, for me, this is the biggest thing I've probably ever done in my life. Unfortunately, the ecosystem service modeling, again, is sort of existing models, not very exciting, one little city. We never got the paper published because it wasn't really too much to publish about. So for the UK Science Councils to have impact with your research, you need to first have a paper published, and then you need to show that your paper was used by someone. And in this case, we did everything. We just didn't publish the paper. So if we had the original paper and all of this, our university or my group would probably have received, I don't know, a couple of £1 million worth of additional funding from the Research Council in the UK. Because I never published this as a paper, it's not eligible as an impact case. Well, thank you very much, but that's it. All rather disappointing. Other than that, I established a collaboration with the local council. On the last day of this original mapping project, I got the person there who was just about to leave because her contract ran out. I got her to write 3 sentences for a Horizon Europe proposal. They needed case studies, and she just wrote 3 sentences about Edinburgh. The project got funded. The council got 200,000 euros. We got €1 million, and we're doing fun things together. So there was a positive outcome from all of this, sort of in metrics and so on. It's just all sort of haphazard and by chance. So I don't know, I gave you some examples of collaborations and things that worked and didn't work. I found that it's been really fun and rewarding to do these projects and really interesting to work with non-academic collaborators on these things. And they're often more fun to work with than some academic colleagues. But the academic structures, the infrastructure in the university, the funding and so on is not supportive. all this problem-based stuff. It takes time to understand what the problems are. It takes time to make connections and relationships with other people to understand how they work, what is important for them. This integrative, interactive, and emergent stuff, brilliant, but basically it's chaos. So you have to, I don't know, be able to live with chaos. And these strong collaborations and partnerships, that just takes patience. So it's not easy, but it's a lot of fun. Also, to be able to do this type of research, you end up developing skills that you don't necessarily get through your academic career or your academic training. So ways of collaborating and listening and understanding and being patient and all those types of things. Sometimes they're framed under the inner development goals, the skills that you need to have to be able to deliver the sustainable development goals. These are things I think we need to teach more of in our universities and sort of understand better. But yeah, I guess as a take-home message on my last slide, I don't know, the landscape scale, I think that's where it happens, a lot of the things, and it's a really interesting place to work. And yeah, you need to be a bit undisciplined to find solutions. And yeah, that's sort of been my journey, and it's been fun, but also challenging at times. That was it.